You blasted...
Corvettes.
Why didn't you mind your own business? Might have gotten away with it, too. If it wasn't for these blasted...
Corvettes.
Blasted meddling...
Corvettes.
And it would have been mine if it hadn't been to those meddling...
Corvettes.
Welcome back to another fleet composition testing video. Today I'm going to be asking the question, does screening work? Can we use a number of smaller ships in our fleet to screen damage away from our larger ships and therefore win the engagement by having more of our ships survive that initial salvo, that alpha strike? I have investigated this by testing the fleet compositions. I've got the results. Let's talk about it and let's dive in. So far, nothing has been able to beat a mixture of artillery and carrier battleships at a 70-30 mix with 70% artillery, 30% carriers. Now, that is the fleet we're mainly going to be testing against. Of course, we do have to note that a pure artillery battleship fleet will defeat that mixed fleet, so we'll also be testing against what those fleets too. And how will we be drawing up the selections? Well, I'm going to be utilizing my ship class analysis table. Link to that video down below in the description if you haven't already seen it. My summary of all the previous testing I did of individual ship types against each other. What I am going to do is take a fleet of battleships and splice into them a few smaller ships. I'm going to try corvettes, destroyers and cruisers. Now, looking at my table, I can see that I want to try the torpedo corvette. That's the good corvette to use. I also want to try the artillery cruiser, and then of course as well the artillery destroyer. Those are going to be the best ships I have to come up against these battleships. Hopefully they can do the job, but we're just going to have to find out and see if screening ships really is effective inside the same fleet. Of course, what I'm not going to be looking at here is separate fleets. If you've got a small fleet of screening ships in front of your main fleet, that's not something I'm testing here today. I'm simply looking at the composition of an individual fleet. And generally speaking, the theory is here, and the reason I'm testing this one is myself and quite a lot of other people that I know of do like to mix in between 10 and 20% of a smaller ship type, usually corvettes, sometimes destroyers. I've never really seen cruisers done, but I'm going to test that to bring you some results today. But the theory here is that in the initial salvo, your smaller ships will be in front because they're slightly faster. They'll take the brunt of the enemy attack. They'll take most of that damage from the large X-slot and L-slot weapons, which will then mean that your larger ships, which are unharmed, then get to fire in response afterwards, and you'll have more of a fleet left over at the end of the battle, or indeed actually after that first salvo, to then continue firing to hopefully win the day. Something important to note here in my fleets, in the fleets I've tested against each other, I have made sure to have equal number of ships based on economic cost. So that doesn't mean they are exactly the same number of ships. That means that we have the same pool of resources to spend, and with that we've built a number of ships. That tended to be only a few naval capacity points different, but overall it really wasn't too big a deal. So what are the ship designs that I'm going to be using? Well, first off, let's take a look at the battleships. I'm going to use an artillery battleship and a carrier battleship. Of course, I'm going to be using the mega cannon. That came out on top as the best weapon in my X-slot testing, and then I'll be using neutron launchers in those other slots. Now, of course, with the carrier, I've got a carrier core, but this ship, the good thing about it is it still has that X-slot and it still has a neutron launcher, so it does massive initial damage with that X-slot from a long range before its carriers will eventually join the fight. For the cruisers, I've got two designs, an artillery cruiser and a carrier cruiser. The artillery cruiser has two large and two medium slots. On those large slots, I've thrown in neutron launchers, the best L-slot weapon in the game. And in the medium slot, I am trying to balance these ship designs, so we've got the kinetic there. For the carrier, of course, I've swapped out that central core segment again for a carrier segment. The issue with these designs, of course, is they're missing an X-slot weapon. As usual, anything a carrier can do, a battleship can do better. So I don't expect any miracles from these ships as screening ships, but we will have to see. With destroyers, I've only got one design that I'm going to be using for the screening ship, and that design is an artillery destroyer. This is, against battleships, the best destroyer you can get. We've thrown in a neutron launcher there, we've got a kinetic medium weapon, and we've got as many shields as we can possibly fit onto our ship. Last but definitely not least, we have corvette design here. So I've gone with the missile boat. I've gone with a regular type of missile, not a torpedo, because we're not coming up against things with large amounts of armor. We do want that plus 25% damage to hull bonus. In addition, we've got a kinetic weapon on there to try and deal with some of those shields. Against a pure artillery battleship fleet, this design should actually do pretty well. You should in fact force that artillery battleship fleet to retreat. Yes, you'll take larger losses, but you can force a retreat. We will, however, have to see if the smaller hull points here have any impact on the screening efficiency of these ships in relation to these screening fleet compositions that we're testing today. If you're enjoying this video, please leave a like. If we get 800 likes on this video, I will do a Titan testing video where we're going to test out using Titans in different fleets. So if you'd like to see that, please leave a like. How did these fleets do when we actually tested them out though? So first let's look at the results for the corvettes. Now I was definitely expecting the corvettes to do reasonably well. We know that they do quite well against artillery battleships. They are quite good at soaking up some of that firepower with their evasion, because those battleships are shooting at them and nothing is getting through with that very, very high evasion and the very low tracking of battleships. First thing I did was I took my mixed fleet of artillery and carriers, that is 70% artillery, 30% carriers, and I spliced in 10% corvettes. So I took out some battleships and I made sure that 10% of the overall fleet was corvettes, and this was my composition that I'm going to test against a fleet of battleships. I'm going to test them against both artillery carrier mix and the just artillery battleships. What did we see here? Well, we faced off against the mixed fleet, so that was both mixed fleets against each other. I was a little surprised actually that the losses were so even. However, at the end of a full engagement, the battleship fleets did lose slightly less than my screen fleet. How did the actual engagements go? Well, when the mixed screen fleet came up against just artillery battleships, they lost every engagement. And you can see here from the data, they also took a significant number more losses than just the battleships did by themselves. Though that has much more to do with artillery battleships coming up against an artillery carrier mix than it does with just having these corvettes spliced into screen. And when you move over and come to fighting the mixed fleets against each other, what you do see is you get slightly more wins for the screen fleet, but that's only around 5% or so that I found in my tests. And overall, that's within the margins of my errors actually. So I really can't say that splicing in the corvettes is particularly good or particularly bad for your fleet. And when I had just artillery battleships in my screening fleet against artillery battleships, I actually got the numbers slightly the other way. So what this kind of looks like to me is if you're coming up against just artillery battleships and you want to win the engagement, if you're running some screening ships, that's actually not a good idea. You're better off removing them. But if you're running a mixed fleet, mixed artillery battleships and mixed carrier battleships, and you come up against the same kind of fleet, throwing a few screening corvettes in there may just be useful and may help you win the engagement. But I really do need to stress this. The difference is very, very small here. I was actually quite surprised that basically it seemed to be pretty irrelevant. The main differences we are seeing here is, as I said before, simply the difference between an pure artillery battleship fleet against an artillery carrier mixed fleet. If you're enjoying this video and other videos on my channel and you'd like to do something to help support the channel, you can do just that. You can become a member of this channel on YouTube, or you can jump over to Patreon and there's a link to that down below in the description. And at this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all my supporters. Your financial and collaborative contributions really help me to create all of these videos. How about destroyers? Now, I personally have been favouring running destroyers. They've got quite a high get disengaged chance. That's due to some of the base modifiers that destroyers have. And I was actually thinking that I could splice in some destroyers, use them as a screen in a battleship fleet, and that would be quite a useful thing to do. They would soak up initial damage, possibly even retreat, FTL disengage out of there, and allow me to win the overall battle. Was that the case? Let's look at the results. Now, the first thing that struck me looking at the results across the board was that the destroyers consistently brought down the overall numbers for the mixed fleet, for this screening fleet. Now, that is quite a problem. It's quite a contrast to what happened with the corvettes. Across the board, for basically every engagement type. That means even when we had an artillery battleship fleet with obviously a sprinkling of destroyers in there, and we came up against a mixed fleet, which is an engagement type that we expect our artillery battleships to win. But of course, this actually turned out not to be the case. Running these destroyers in there, adding these screening ships, it didn't actually help the overall effectiveness of our fleets. It brought it down, and quite drastically. So when our screening fleet had a mixture of artillery battleships and carrier battleships, this is one that we expect to be the weaker really. Here against just battleships, we kind of came out pretty even overall against the battleships. Unless, of course, we fought the pure artillery battleships. In all cases, the losses for the mixed fleet, for this screening fleet, were greater, and they really did not help us overcome the raw power of artillery battleships. But what happened when we had just artillery battleships along with destroyers in this fleet that we're testing, the fleet composition test? Well, as you can see from the data here, when we came up against a mixed fleet of artillery and carrier, we didn't win. And that's quite striking, because really these artillery battleships, we would expect them to win. By adding in this 10% destroyer screen, we've actually limited the effectiveness of our artillery battleships and can no longer beat a mixed artillery carrier battleship fleet. So that's actually quite a problem. And then against just pure artillery battleships, we took significantly more losses than just that pure fleet did. That is again quite a problem. So you really don't want to be using destroyers as a screen. This set of data really quite nicely shows off the fact that it is a bad idea to do that. I thought it would be a good idea. I am definitely surprised by these results, but the case is clear here. Do not try to use destroyers in your fleet to screen damage away from battleships. How did cruisers do? Can we add cruisers as a screen for our mixed fleets?
You serious?
No. No, we cannot. Do not do it. Do not try to use cruisers as screening ships inside of a battleship fleet. It doesn't work. It brings your numbers down even worse than the destroyers. It was atrocious. I don't even need to show you the result. It was just completely terrible. I didn't even have to go past initial testing to see how bad it was. These didn't require thorough tests, shockingly. Do not ever try to use cruisers to come up against battleships. It just won't work.